Today, I'd like to take a look at the relationship between joy and suffering, and to do so from both a Buddhist perspective and a Christian perspective. Um, the 8th century Buddhist master, uh, Shantideva, has a wonderful saying that kind of sums up our ability to kind of grapple with suffering, that's different aspects of suffering that strike us at different times in our lives. Uh, Shantaveda said, if something can be done about the situation, what need is there for dejection? And if nothing can be done about it, what use is there for being dejected? Interesting saying when you look at it and unpack it a bit, right? I mean, if something can be done about the situation, don't be dejected. Do that something. Take some action. If there's a suffering in your life, or there's an obstacle, or something's happening, or you're not doing well with something, well, figure out, well, what can I do? Take a positive step rather than being dejected and saying, oh, woe is me, this is terrible. Well, can I do something about it? On the other hand, if I can't do anything about it, why be dejected? I have no control over the situation. Maybe it's a situation where somebody else is causing some suffering, and then there's nothing that I can do about that particular situation. It's beyond my control. So there's no use really being dejected about it. And it kind of gets to the Buddhist attitude about suffering, that suffering is mostly caused by our own desires. And when you look at suffering, different aspects of suffering, if you take your own desire out of it, you really see a different picture. And part of the idea of that struggle with suffering is to widen our perspective. Because when we look at things from a wider perspective, we reduce the worrying about our own suffering. Sometimes we think, oh, my suffering is so bad. Look what's happening to me. I'm not getting ahead at work and everybody else is. This is terrible. But then when we widen out and look at other people in the world and what they are going through and what they are struggling with, it gives us a whole different perspective. And we are really filled with more gratitude for our own situation and not so caught up in the concept of suffering. And it's really not a denial of pain or denial of suffering, but a shift in our perspective. Perspective from oneself to others. Others suffer as well. I'm not the only one in the world who is suffering. And so when we notice that other people are suffering, our own suffering doesn't seem to be so awful or so outrageous, particularly if there's not too much we can do about our suffering, as Shantaveda has said. So it gives us a whole different perspective on suffering. And one of the ways that we can help deal with suffering, because suffering, it can really be an antidote to our joy, right? So one of the ways we can deal with suffering is to unite our situation with other people. So that we take a look at what we're going through, and we widen our perspective, and we unite that suffering with what other people are going through. Because the reality is that we are all connected. Each one of us is a brother and sister. And so when we make that connection and we see the suffering of other people and unite our suffering with that, it gives us a different aspect, a different perspective, a different way of looking at some suffering that we might be going through. So we might have a child who is very sick, and we're suffering as a result of that. We're upset. And then many times we'll go into a hospital and we'll see other children that are suffering, and their suffering is more acute and more difficult. And so we try to unite our suffering with their suffering and become more compassionate towards them and realize that our suffering, as great as it might be for us, there's a larger aspect here, and to kind of widen that perspective a bit, and to try to unite our suffering with what other people are going through. Wherever you have friends, that's your country. And wherever you receive love, that's your home. So love is such an important aspect of this. And wherever you receive love, that can be your home. So again, you might be going through some particular suffering, but you encounter a person who is a very loving person, and that certainly helps you with your suffering. And in the same way, you're going through suffering, but you bring love to another person as you widen your perspective and see others that are suffering. Again, that helps them with their suffering, and it helps you deal with your own suffering. So again, it gives you a different perspective. And where your friends are, that's where your country is. A lot of times we think of, our country and how wonderful our country is, but friendship makes a country. Because friendship builds community. And where we build community, that's where our love is, that's where our friendships are, and that really becomes our country. That becomes where we live, and that's where we thrive, and that's where we grow as persons. There will be frustrations in life as we deal with difficult situations, as we deal with suffering. The question is not how to escape those frustrations. It's how do I use a particular frustration as something positive? So I might be frustrated in dealing with a particular relationship. Somebody is giving me hassles. Somebody's making me very upset. So how do I deal with those frustrations? How do I use that as something positive? How do I say, well, that person is really challenging me? How can I grow to be a better person to deal with that situation? What can I do to take that frustration and really use it for my own personal growth? And therefore, through that suffering, through that frustration, through that challenge, through that difficulty, become a kinder person. As I get an insight into that other person who is causing the frustration. Or there might be times when I'm trying to do a particular task, and it's not working out for me. I don't maybe have the physical strength to do it. I'm trying to excel in a sport. I'm not doing that well, and the point might be, well, what can I do to improve? Maybe more practice will help. Maybe getting instruction will help. Maybe being more dedicated to that particular task. So taking the frustration and saying, well, what can I do to improve and to become better as a person? And so the question I am confronted with as I'm dealing with suffering which can impact my ability to experience joy, suffering that can weigh me down. The question I can face is, how can I spread compassion and love? And by spreading compassion and love, how can I overcome that particular suffering? How can I widen that perspective? How can I reach out to others? How can I become a more loving person? And all of a sudden, that particular suffering takes on a new look. Instead of seeing it as something negative in my life, and something that's frustrating me, I see it as a challenge to become a more compassionate and loving human being.